You know what I find fascinating about the Green Bay Packers is you talk about a team that's had a nice long run of sustained success over the past 7 years or so. I mean, they've had a lot of good things going for them. And even when you go back to the Favre era, 2007, and that team that made it to the NFC Championship game, this is over the past decade. It's been a good decade for the Green Bay Packers organization. It really, truly has. And I find it very interesting that a team that made it to the playoffs and won a playoff game this year and was competitive in the divisional round, I've seen Packers fans talk about how Mike McCarthy should be fired and how Ted Thompson is an idiot. And I'm like, wow, that's incredible to me. Look, I understand the frustration. And I get that you are starting to wonder if you'll ever get back to the promised land, so to speak, with Aaron Rodgers. And you don't want to see a guy like Aaron Rodgers have won a Super Bowl so early in his career, similar to how Brett Favre did in '96. And then he never wins another one, and you're like all these other years, and you never got back there, and it's frustrating. Because those type of caliber of quarterbacks don't come along every day. Brett Favre, we know now, is a first ballot Hall of Famer. No big surprise. Aaron Rodgers someday is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. You want to see those guys get more than one Super Bowl ring. I get it, and I understand it. And I can understand the frustration of when you enter the season, you've got some Super Bowl hopes, and it doesn't quite go the way you planned. I don't know about the Ted Thompson being an idiot and Mike McCarthy should be fired talk either. The grass is always greener on the other side is a popular saying. I could understand if you're talking about a Cincinnati Bengals situation where Marvin Lewis has been the head coach for 13 years. You're 0-7 in the playoffs under him. You've made it to the playoffs 5 straight years, and each time you've lost in the first round. Especially in the way the Bengals conducted themselves in that wild card game against the Steelers in Cincinnati. Then I could see. But, it's like, I get it, I understand it, but I just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. Because it seems like there's a lot of gloom and doom talk, and the fact of the matter is there were still things that went well for the Green Bay Packers this year. There were. Yeah, it didn't result in another trip to the NFC Championship game. It didn't result in the trip to Super Bowl 50. You're talking about a team now, for the 6th time in the past 7 years, has a 10-win season to its credit. You're talking about a team that even though they didn't win the division this year, which was a bit of a shock to me, frankly, good job to the Minnesota Vikings, hats off to them. You're talking about a Green Bay Packers team that has made the playoffs 7 straight years. 7 straight years. How many teams in the NFL right now can boast a record of making the playoffs 7 consecutive seasons? The Packers have done that. And they made the playoffs 8 times in the past 9 seasons. That's a hell of a run, a hell of a string of success. It's almost to the point where I think some Packer fans are getting a little spoiled by the consistent, sustained success that they've had over the years and getting a little greedy. I'll take what the Packers have done. You can take what the Bears have done over the past decade. Exactly. But, this is a team that, coming out of the gate, they were hot. They were on fire. They were 6-0, and you're looking at them, and you're like, they're one of the undefeated teams in the league. This team looks like a legit contender. They went 3-1 against the NFC West, 3-1 against the AFC West. At the end of the day, even though they really scuffled the second half of the year, and even though they look like a shell of them former selves in some ways, and there are all types of different problems in different areas, this is still a team that found a way to piece themselves together. They won a playoff game on the road against Washington, where they really took control of the game in the second half, and frankly, I thought they outplayed Arizona for the first half in the divisional game. And even though, yes, you could talk about getting the luck of the draw with the fucking Hail Mary for a second time, how the hell that happens, I still don't know. Some Green Bay Aaron Rodgers magic, perhaps. This is a team that was in a position, had pushed the game to overtime. They had a chance to beat the Arizona Cardinals on the road in the divisional round. The Packers were very, very close to making it back to the NFC Championship game again. So there were still things in the midst of a not great season that still went all right. That still bode well for the future, believe it or not. But what didn't go well for them? And why does this not have the same type of buzz or feel about the Packers as you've had in previous years? Why does it seem like some Packer fans are even more frustrated with this year's result as opposed to last year's result, where you could definitely argue the Packers choked away that NFC Championship game in Seattle because they did? You got to start off with Jordy Nelson's, I almost said Jordy Rogers, Jordy Nelson's ACL injury in the preseason. I mean, that was devastating. You talk about the number one weapon for the Green Bay Packers in the passing game, a guy that can consistently get separation, who can stretch defenses vertically down the field, and you're without him the entire year. And it speaks to, we could talk about, they brought in James Jones, and he had a solid year. But they just paid Randall Cobb a bunch of money. Now you're trying to get him to do something that he's not really designed or built to do, and his performance suffers. You get a little bit of a flash out of Ty Montgomery, but then he gets hurt. You can't really count on him. And then you've got Devontae Adams. You're expecting a big step up in year number 2, and he's battling injuries, and just frankly never happens. And it all leads to, when you combine that with really crappy pass protection, in particular on the perimeter by the Green Bay Packers, which sometimes I think is schematic. They don't leave a blocker in terms of a back or a tight end in nearly enough. They don't do a good enough job of, adjusting their blocking responsibilities in terms of the offensive line. But Aaron Rodgers was under the gun a lot the second half of the year. I mean, he was getting killed. He was getting slaughtered. And he had constantly had people in his face. And when you combine that with receivers that are struggling to get open, that could lead him to make some bad decisions, that could lead to him making some rush throws, not allowing plays to develop the same. Aaron Rodgers ultimately just didn't have an Aaron Rodgers type year. I mean, he didn't even throw for 4,000 yards. No way in hell that I thought that would have happened this year. If I tell you before the season starts, to place one of those bets where you say Aaron Rodgers, 4,000 yards, more or less. Most of you are going to take the more. That's where the lower performing money is going to be, so to speak, because it would seem like it was such a certainty, but it wasn't, and it didn't happen. There's a lot of mitigating factors. Eddie Lacy wasn't very good this year. James Starks had occasional flashes, but they didn't really have a consistent presence in the running game throughout the course of the entire season. So you combine that with the lack of Jordy Nelson and the other receivers failing to get consistent separation with an offensive line that's not doing a very good job at all in pass protection. It's a recipe for disaster. Frankly, this Packers team is lucky they won 10 damn games. Because that second half of the year, they look terrible. They look worse than the Chicago Bears, if I'm being so honest. And speaking of the NFC North, you're the Green Bay Packers. You've ruled the roost for several years. You've won 4 straight divisional titles. You won a Super Bowl back in 2010. It just came off an NFC Championship game appearance in 2014. How in the hell are you going 3-3 in the NFC North? That means you lost to Minnesota once in Week 17 of all weeks. You believe that? The Packers lost Week 17 in Lambeau with Aaron Rodgers against the Minnesota Vikings. And then they lose to Chicago on Thanksgiving. And then they lose, to Detroit a little bit before that. It's one thing that they lose to Minnesota, but you would have thought they would have lost to Minnesota in Minnesota, but they didn't. They lost to them in Lambeau. But then you lose to Detroit and Chicago too. You just can't do that. You're the Packers. You're supposed to rule the roost. You're supposed to own that division, and that ended up costing them a little bit. I really think it did. Now, you also look at the fact that they started off 6-0, but they finished 10-6. That means they went 4-6 in their last 10 games. It's interesting how those snowballs can build in terms of positive momentum or negative momentum. And man, the Green Bay Packers, as soon as that Sunday night game against the Denver Broncos happened and the Broncos kind of schooled them and took them to town and they got in Rodgers' face all night, you're sitting there watching it and you're like, oh my Jesus. This team looks terrible. And they didn't have the same mystique about them, I guess would be the thing. So now you head to the draft, which is where the Green Bay Packers have been built so well, frankly, for many years by Ted Thompson. This is not a team that invests heavily in free agency. They follow that tried and true model of building through the draft, developing your own talent, re-signing them because it's cheaper to do so. It's a cheaper way, a more effective way, a more efficient way from a salary cap standpoint in order to build, maintain, run your organization. Well, they got to do a good job in this draft. And the number one priority has to be to improve Aaron Rodgers' protection, period. They need help at offensive tackle. Now, does that mean that they supplant Balaga at right tackle? Does that mean they supplant Bakhtiari at left tackle? Or does that just mean they draft a tackle in the first couple of rounds and he serves as like that versatile third tackle that could swing to either the right or left side? I don't really know. But something needs to happen because they've got to get better protecting Aaron Rodgers. Because if they don't in 2016, the dude's going to get slaughtered again, and this time your tempting fate eventually is going to suffer a big injury. They need something at running back too. If for no other reason you would say than to light a fire under Eddie Lacy's ass, to lose some weight and come more prepared as a professional football player. But they need running back. As you know, James Starks, how much more are you really going to get out of him? You know, they could use a more explosive complement to Eddie Lacy. They could also use potentially somebody to replace Eddie Lacy. I wouldn't be surprised if the Packers spend a day 2 pick on running back. Could it be a second-round pick? Could it be a third-round pick? I'm not really sure. Who would it be? Maybe it's a guy like Kenneth Dixon from Louisiana Tech. Maybe it's a guy like Alex Collins from Arkansas, although I think he might have too many character concerns for the Green Bay Packers to bite on, especially because they feel like they have some character concerns in terms of off-field discipline with Eddie Lacy and decision-making about Eddie Lacy. But they need a running back really, really bad. You know, they really, really do. The best scenario in the world to me for the Green Bay Packers would be if somehow, some way, an Ezekiel Elliott dropped to 27. The Packers would just, you swoop him up, you sprint up to the damn draft board, and you figure it out later. But they need some help on the defensive side of the ball, most notably in the linebacking core. You know, this is a position here where it wouldn't surprise me, whereas last year in the draft, they went with Demarius Randall out of Arizona State round 1, and then they went with Quentin Rollins in round 2 out of Miami of Ohio. I wouldn't be surprised to see them double dip in this draft too early with a couple of linebackers because they definitely need inside linebacker help because, yes, Clay Matthews has been playing there and he's done an adequate job, but he's still best suited for outside linebacker. He's best suited to be a 3-4 edge rusher. And at some point in time, you want to get him back into that position, knowing especially that you've got guys like Nick Perry, who's going to be a free agent, who you're probably not going to want to bring back because he really hasn't done much. Julius Peppers is probably on borrowed time. He had another good, solid year, but how much longer are you going to get that out of him? They need an explosive edge rusher opposite of Clay Matthews. Frankly, it's been a problem for them for years, and they've never effectively addressed it in the draft. The best they did was signing a Julius Peppers, who's given them, frankly, 2 solid seasons now. And then, again, you look at edge, you look at inside linebacker as well once you flip Clay Matthews outside, which ultimately needs to be the goal. You know, is Jake Ryan going to be a starting inside linebacker at the NFL level? Maybe. He's probably a 2-down inside linebacker at best, though, because he's not nearly athletic enough to guard really quick tight ends or wide receivers or running backs. They need an inside linebacker. Good thing for the Packers is this is a solid class, I think, for inside linebackers. Where they're picking at 27, though, the only problem is, will there really be a guy worth the 27th pick at inside linebacker? I think most Packer fans will probably view that position as the number 1 need, and they feel like it's been the number 1 need for the past couple of years. And you could definitely make the argument, I think, again, that it's the number 1 need now. And it's going to need to be addressed at some point in time. I'm just not sold that it's going to be in round 1 because I'm not sure Darren Lee is a great fit for their defensive system inside. I think Reggie Ragland, Jalen Smith, Miles Jack will all be long gone off the board by this point in time. So you're going to desperately reach with that first-round pick to take an inside linebacker if it doesn't make sense. You know, it's not really the Green Bay Packers' forte. It's not their MO, and I don't expect it to be this time around. So we'll see what happens. But most importantly of all, defensively, they've got to fix that. They've got to improve in that linebacking core. They need to get younger and more athletic, more explosive. And then offensively, they need to do a better job of protecting Aaron Rodgers. They need to give him more balance with a more consistent running game. And they just need to improve his blocking in front of him. If they can do those things and you get Jordan Nelson to come back from his ACL tear and be productive in 2016, this is a Green Bay Packers team that can get right back in the mix. This is a team that can get right back in the mix and be a Super Bowl threat again as soon as 2016. But if they don't, you know, they might be ceding the division to the Minnesota Vikings again in 2016. And you be prepared, Packers fans, if they don't address some of these areas of concern, to see a lot more of the football that you saw throughout this season next year.